All right, in this video, we're going to go over the basics of line of sight. And because point blank is abstracted, it's not going to be wholly simple when it comes to tracing your line of sight to determine whether or not you have a clear shot. So when we're looking at it, the basics for if they're in the same area, so again, the letter A, B, C, D, and so on, that's fairly simple. And if they're in the same sector, that's fairly simple as well. Remember, sectors are your numbers. So 0, 1, 2, and so on, 0 being here in the center. So just as a quick example, we have a couple of units here, SS squad, infantry squad. If the infantry squad wanted to fire at the SS guys and they're in the same area, they're going to look at the terrain cards in between them, right? In between their sectors. Now, the terrain in their sector comes into play when it comes to defensive roles and all that, but not for line of sight. But we look at the cards in between. And remember, they can either be clear, degrading, or blocking, okay, when it comes to line of sight. So, and if you have no terrain, so the terrain hasn't been revealed, then it's considered clear when you're checking for line of sight. So our infantry squad would be able to fire at the SS squad because we've got clear terrain here, so they could see them. If there was a degrading card here, something like the brush that the infantry squad is in, then it would be degrading. And if it was blocking terrain like the woods, then they would not be able to see them. They would not have a clear line of sight. Make sure you keep in mind that if there are two degrading cards, it counts as blocking. Now, when you are adjacent, you are automatically considered to have line of sight, and it's going to work the same way in the sectors. All right, so for SS squad, we're here just as a rough example. Clear terrain in between them, they'd be able to see. Adjacent, obviously they'd be able to see. And again, same thing, degrading terrain, two degrading terrains blocking, blocking terrain automatically blocking, all that stuff. So straight lines are easy when it comes to line of sight, real easy to determine. It's when you are in different areas. So if someone's in A and someone else is in C, that's when the rules get a little different. So again, looking at our example of our infantry squad and our SS squad, now the infantry squad firing at the SS squad, when you're looking at this, normally you would think, well, I trace line of sight here, but that could work if they're just a couple of areas away, but it wouldn't work if they're over in D or E farther away. It would become incredibly difficult to determine what areas those lines were drawn across. So the way you're going to determine your line of sight when it comes to different areas is that you trace your line of sight up to 0, the center, all right, and determine whether or not that's clear. And if it's clear to both, then they have line of sight. So what I mean by this is our infantry squad here, if they're wanting to fire at the SS guys, they're going to trace their line of sight to here, to 0. And it's everything in between them and 0. Doesn't matter how many terrain cards, you're going to look for the same thing, blocking, degrading terrain, including the terrain here in 0. So we see here, we've got clear terrain. So they're clear. Then the same thing, you're going to trace the line of sight from the SS squad to their 0 in their area. So this would be A0 here. There's road terrain. That's considered clear. And again, remember, if there's no terrain, it is also considered clear. So that will be clear. So since it's clear from here to here and here to here, it's considered line of sight for them to fire at each other. All the same rules that I was just talking about apply. So if there are two degrading terrains, then it becomes blocking. If there's any blocking terrain, when you're tracing here to here, here to here. And again, it doesn't matter how far back it is. This, I've got it zoomed in because I'm filming, but you can be tracing across multiple sectors to get up to the 0, and you're going to look at the terrain in all of those sectors for both as they're getting up here to the 0. So if we were to reverse this, and let's say the woods were here instead and they were on the road, now this would be considered blocked because tracing from the SS squad up to their 0 area here, that's blocking terrain. It's still clear to here, but it's no longer clear to here. So that would be a blocked shot, and they would not have line of sight to each other to conduct that attack. Now, the other thing that changes when it comes to this being abstracted is if they're at different heights from each other. So if a unit's lower or higher than the other, if the firing unit is lower, you're going to trace over to the area that the target is in and then to them. So instead of tracing here to the center, instead this SS squad would trace over to here, and this one would trace to here. So you would come across and over to them, completing kind of an L, and it would be the same thing. Say these guys are firing down on them, instead of tracing 0 to 0 like we did for the different areas. And this is just if they're at different heights. Say they're higher, the infantry squad, they're going to trace up to the sector that their target's in and then over to them, looking for the same thing: degrading terrain, blocking terrain. Degrading terrain does give the person being shot at some bonuses, some benefits, defensive modifiers, and blocking terrain, obviously you can't take the shot. So really, when it comes to your line of sight, it is very simple as long as they're in the same areas, right? If they're in the same area, same sector, it makes it very easy. You're just tracing in between them, seeing what's in between them. When they're in different areas and sectors, that's when you're going to have to keep track of how it's being abstracted. If they're not at different heights from each other, you're going to trace to 0 for each one and see if the shot is going to be clear. And then if they're at different heights, then you're going to trace over to the target's area and sector and determine whether or not that line is clear.